My father died on a Tuesday morning, and I found out about it from a text message. Not a call, a text from a nurse I had never met, sent at 6:47 a.m., saying simply that he had passed peacefully in his sleep and that she was sorry for my loss. I remember staring at my phone in my kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand, trying to understand how the man who taught me to ride a bike had become a name on a screen I had to scroll up to see again. My name is Danielle. I was 41 years old when my father, Gerald, died, and if you had asked me a year earlier how close we were, I would have said close enough. We talked on holidays. I sent birthday cards. I told myself that was normal, that everyone's family drifted a little once the kids grew up and moved 3 states away. My brother Patrick lived even farther, out in Arizona, running a small contracting business with 2 kids of his own. My sister Sarah stayed closest, only 40 minutes from Dad, but even she admitted later that she hadn't seen him in person in almost 5 months before he passed. We told ourselves he was fine. He always said he was fine. "Don't worry about your old man," he'd say on the phone, and we didn't. That was the arrangement, unspoken but real. He would carry his own weight, and we would call when we could, and everyone would go on pretending that was enough. The funeral was small, a handful of his old coworkers from the plant, a neighbor to us, and one woman I didn't recognize standing quietly near the back, wearing a plain gray coat and holding a single white flower instead of the arrangements everyone else brought. She didn't approach us, she didn't sign the guest book with a name I could place. She just watched the casket lower, wiped her eyes once, and left before the reception. I asked Sarah who she was. Sarah shrugged. "Maybe someone from the hospital," she said. Neither of us thought much more about it that day. There was too much else, the paperwork, the house to sort through, the strange quiet of a childhood home with no one living in it anymore. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when the lawyer called us in to go over the will, that the woman in the gray coat came back into the story. And everything I thought I understood about my father's final year came apart in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and a box of tissues nobody had touched. The lawyer's office was small and smelled like old carpet and printer toner. Patrick had flown in for it, jet-lagged and irritable, checking his phone every few minutes like the meeting was cutting into something more important. Sarah sat beside me, her knee bouncing under the table. We expected this to be simple. Dad didn't have much: the house, a modest savings account, an old truck he refused to replace. We assumed it would be split 3 ways, the way these things usually go, a formality more than anything. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Alvarez, cleared his throat and slid 3 folders across the table, one for each of us. "Your father updated his will 14 months ago," he said. "I want to walk you through it carefully." 14 months. That number sat oddly in my chest before I even knew why it mattered. He explained the house would be sold, and the proceeds, along with what remained of his savings, would be split between the 3 of us as expected. But then he paused, and I watched him choose his next words like he was stepping around something fragile. "There is also a life insurance policy," he said. "A term policy worth $80,000. Your father named a sole beneficiary for that policy. It is not divided between the 3 of you." Patrick sat up straighter. "Who?" Mr. Alvarez looked down at the folder. "A woman named Louise Bennett. She was your father's home hospice nurse for the final 11 months of his life." The room went very quiet. Sarah's knee stopped bouncing. I felt something hot rise in my throat, something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger but sat right in the space between them. "He had a hospice nurse," Sarah said, and her voice cracked on the word hospice like it was the first time she was hearing it, which I realized with a sick drop in my stomach it was. None of us had known our father was sick enough to need one. We drove to the house that Dad had lived in for 30 years, the house none of us had really looked at closely in longer than we wanted to admit. And we searched it like strangers looking for evidence of a life we hadn't paid attention to. In the hallway closet, behind his winter coats, we found a folder of medical bills. Congestive heart failure, diagnosed almost 2 years before he died. Appointments, prescriptions. A folded pamphlet about home hospice services with a phone number circled twice in his shaky handwriting. Sarah sat down on the hallway floor with the folder in her lap and started crying in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. "He never told us," she kept saying. "He never told us he was that sick." Patrick was angrier. He paced the length of the hallway, saying this Louise woman must have manipulated him, must have gotten close to a dying man and talked him into rewriting his policy, that we should contact a lawyer about contesting it. I understood the impulse. It was easier to be angry at a stranger than to sit with the shape of what we were actually looking at: 30 years of a man quietly deciding not to burden us, and then, in his final year, needing someone and none of us being the ones he called. We found Louise's number on one of the hospice intake forms, and against Patrick's objections, I called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful, like she'd been waiting for this call and dreading it at the same time. We agreed to meet her at a diner near the hospital where she still worked. She showed up in scrubs, straight off a shift, and sat across from the three of us with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never drank from. "He said something to me once that I haven't been able to forget," Louise told us, her eyes wet. "He said, I raised them to have their own lives. I'm not going to take that from them now." Sarah put her hand over her mouth. I felt my own eyes burn. Louise explained the insurance policy wasn't something she asked for or even knew about until after he died. Dad had changed the beneficiary quietly, through the insurance company directly, months before he passed, without telling her. She only found out at the funeral when a woman from the insurance office reached out to confirm her mailing address. "I think," Louise said slowly, "he did it because I was there. Because I saw him at his worst and stayed anyway. I think it wasn't really about the money. I think it was the only way he knew how to say thank you to somebody, since he'd stopped believing he needed to say anything to the people who loved him from far away." None of us said anything for a long moment. Patrick, who had wanted to fight this, who had wanted to blame someone, just sat there with his jaw tight, staring at his coffee. "Keep it," I finally said. "He wanted you to have it. He made that choice with a clear mind, and I think it was the only thing he had left to give that felt like his own decision at the end." Louise shook her head, tears falling freely now. "I sat with him almost every day for 11 months, and never once did he mention wanting anything back from you. Not resentment, not blame. He talked about you three like you hung the moon. I think he just wanted to protect you the way he always had, by carrying things alone." Sarah asked her quietly what his last days were like. Louise told us he asked to have the radio on, an old country station he used to play in his truck when we were kids. She said he hummed along on the mornings he had the strength for it. She said the last thing he said clearly 2 days before he passed was our names, all three in order, oldest to youngest, followed by, "Tell them I'm proud. Tell them not to feel bad about anything." We left that diner different people than we walked in as. Patrick called his kids that night, something he later told me he hadn't done in almost 2 weeks. Sarah started going through Dad's old photo albums instead of just his paperwork, and I found myself calling an old friend I'd let slip away, just to hear her voice, just because I finally understood how quickly the chance to reach out simply disappears. We didn't contest the will, we didn't need to anymore. A month later, the three of us met at Dad's house one last time before it sold, and we invited Louise. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching the door frames, the kitchen counter, like she was saying goodbye to a place that had quietly become part of her life too. Before she left, she handed Sarah a small notebook. Dad had kept it by his bedside during his final months, and Louise said she thought it belonged with us, not her. Inside were short entries, some just a sentence long, written in his unsteady hand. Memories of us as kids. Small apologies for things we never even knew he carried guilt over. And on the very last page, dated 4 days before he died, one line, "I hope they know love doesn't need to be loud to be real. I just wanted them to keep living even while I was going quiet." I think about that line often now. About how much of loving someone is really about the courage to ask for help before it's too late, and how much of grief is realizing all the quiet ways someone loved you that you were too far away, or too busy, or too certain of tomorrow to notice in time. We don't get another chance with him, but we got Louise, and in a strange way we got each other back, closer now than we'd been in years. Phone calls that last longer than 5 minutes, visits that aren't tied to holidays. My father spent his final year being cared for by a stranger because he couldn't bring himself to ask his own children for help. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself for that, but I've stopped needing to understand why he did it, and started simply trying to live in a way that makes sure no one I love ever has to hide their hardest days from me again.